But first, you may have seen headlines like this in recent weeks.
Vaping, how e-cigarettes could be holding you back from quitting smoking.
E-cigarettes won't help you quit. Smokers using vapors are 28% less likely to ditch traditional cigarettes.
Not good news if you were hoping to use e-cigarettes to help you give up smoking, but this comes just a week or so after one brand of e-cigarettes was approved as an aid to stop people smoking by the UK medicine regulator. That's the first step to becoming available on prescription. So what's going on? Well, more or less his Wesley Stevenson has been looking into this. Hello, Wes.
Hello.
Now, this study, what do we know about it?
Well, it was published in one of the Lancet spin-off journals, the Lancet Respiratory Medicine.
That's a well-respected journal, yeah?
It is, yes, that's right. And it's a meta-analysis. That means that the authors reviewed all of the recent academic literature to see what effect e-cigarettes had on people quitting smoking. So they sifted out all the sketchier papers, the ones that didn't have control groups, for example, and then they put the rest together to draw their conclusions. The lead author was Professor Stanton Glantz from the Centre for Tobacco Control Research and Education at the University of California.
What we found was that smokers who use e-cigarettes are much less likely to quit smoking than smokers who don't use e-cigarettes. The odds of having quit if you're a smoker using e-cigarettes is about 28% lower than if smokers who don't use e-cigarettes. And so while e-cigarettes are heavily promoted and used to help people quit smoking, they not only don't help them quit, they actually hurt.
Very clear then, if you want to quit smoking, e-cigarettes are only going to get in the way. And Stanton Glantz and his colleagues looked only at the best research, and then they published their review in a respected journal. So why are you still sitting here, Wes? Case closed, surely.
Well, the reason I'm still sitting here, Tim, is because this study has attracted an unusual amount of criticism. For example, from Professor Linda Bold. She's Deputy Director of the UK Centre for Tobacco and Alcohol Studies at the University of Stirling.
Someone has said if you put garbage in, you get garbage out sometimes when you do a meta-analysis. We're too early in this field, actually, to rely on these very variable studies. So I appreciate the authors did their best, but in my view, it's not good enough.
OK, but she's just one critic.
Yes, but there's also Professor Anne McNeil, who's Professor of Tobacco Addiction at King's College London, whose research paper was one of those reviewed in the meta-analysis, and she says the study is not scientific.
Ooh. Anyone else?
Professor Peter Hayek, another eminent academic in this field, who was author of a Cochrane review into the same subject. He described the meta-analysis as grossly misleading, and one of the peer reviewers of the paper also recommended that it not be published.
OK, so what's the problem with it?
The critics think that the papers that underpinned Professor Glantz's meta-analysis aren't really good enough for him to draw his conclusion. There are problems with how use of e-cigarettes is measured, for example, and there's a huge variation in the types of e-cigarettes used in these studies. Some of them give a big nicotine hit, for instance, and others don't. But the big problem is you would probably expect, if you were going to draw a conclusion about how useful e-cigarettes are in helping people quit, then you might look at papers that focused on people who are trying to quit.
Yeah, you might, indeed.
But no, someone else who's criticised this paper is Professor Robert West, and he heads up a team at University College London that researches ways to help people quit smoking. He says that this analysis has mashed together some very different studies.
On the one hand, you have people who specifically use an electronic cigarette as part of an attempt to stop smoking. And there are very few of those studies. But to mix them in with studies where you've got people using an e-cigarette and are not particularly trying to stop smoking is mixing apples and oranges.
So some of the studies specifically look at people who are using e-cigarettes to quit, and they assess how helpful the e-cigarettes are.
Yes, but some of the other studies aren't looking at that at all. They're tracking smokers who use e-cigarettes for whatever reason. For example, because smoking in a bar or an office is illegal and they want to get a nicotine hit without being arrested, for example.
So the studies are following these people and they're asking if they quit, but they weren't necessarily trying to quit.
Exactly. So throw all those studies together with the studies that are examining attempts to quit, and you've got a pretty confusing picture.
Professor West said that there are very few studies that look at how useful e-cigarettes are to people who are trying to stop smoking. But those few studies, what do they show?
Out of all the studies in this review, there are only really 3 that look at people trying to quit. But Professor West say they contradict what Professor Stanton Glantz found.
With the studies where people are using an electronic cigarette, specifically in a quit attempt, the evidence is consistent. You have 2 small randomised trials which show almost approximately a 50 to 100% improvement in quit success. And you've got a study that we did, a real-world study with a large number of people, which showed a similar kind of level of improvement.
So e-cigarettes do help people quit, but they're not magic. They only work for people who are actually trying to stop smoking. And that contrasts with what Professor Glantz found in his meta-analysis. Does he actually acknowledge any of these shortcomings?
Now, Professor Glantz does take on board some of these criticisms in his paper, but he says he sticks by his analysis and believes that he has controlled for all of the shortcomings in his paper and concludes that none of them really matter.
And it sounds as though Professor Glantz has a tough job ahead of him convincing his peers.
Yes, I asked all the critical academics whether they thought this paper should have been published, and all of them said no.
So what has the journal said? I mean, surely it has a reputation to protect.
It does, and I spoke to the editor of the Lancet Respiratory Medicine, Emma Granger, and asked her whether she feels that they should have published this paper, especially as even one of the peer reviewers had said it shouldn't be published.
We thought this paper uniquely looked at how they're being used currently in the real world. And it came up with a conclusion that perhaps might be surprising at first glance, that they're not necessarily helping people to quit.
I mean, I spoke to one of the guys who peer-reviewed it for The Lancet. He recommended it be rejected. There is a problem here with this paper, isn't there?
No, I disagree. I don't think there is a problem with this paper. And part of an editor's role is to judge the reviewer's comments. And if there's a mixture of comments, then that's the editor's role to decide, which comments to balance in their decision-making process.
Emma Granger and our very own Wesley Stevenson. Thank you, Wes. You're listening to More or Less.